Coming up next, my Halloween build. Well, hey everyone, and welcome back to another Initiative Mother. Now, bear with me, I'm doing something a little awkward here. I'm recording a new intro to an already edited video because I need to explain something here. You're going to be watching a video of the building of this Planet of the Apes Dr. Zaius kit from Aurora. And I made a major mistake along the way. I actually assumed that this kit was supposed to depict a scene from the original Planet of the Apes movie. In fact, just looking at the box art and seeing that he was among some ruins there, I just thought that it was supposed to be a scene from the archaeological site that they showed at the end of the first movie. And so I proceeded on that assumption, and when I looked at the way the figure was molded, I noticed that the suit did not match what I saw on screen from the original movie. There were markings along the sleeve and on the chest. It just did not go with what was seen in that movie. So I assumed they just got it wrong and it was inaccurate. And so I proceeded to modify the figure to make it look like what is seen in the original movie. Now, I proceeded on to the display base, and along the way, I was showing my friend Ken Spriggs some pictures of what I was up to, and he noticed that the parts on that display base looked to him like the props from Beneath the Planet of the Apes. So after he made that comment, I went onto the net and looked up some pictures from Beneath the Planet of the Apes, and sure enough, that's what those props or those pieces are supposed to represent. So I realized at that point I made a major error, and really, if I wanted to build this kit as intended, I was not supposed to make any modifications to the figure itself at all, other than what I wanted to do was to just at least change the head sculpt. So what you're going to watch then is the building of this kit all the way through to the completion of that display base, and I'm going to stop it there, and then we're going to transition into me building a whole new display base that coincides with the modifications I made to the figure. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. Well, hey everyone, and welcome back to another Initiative Modeler. It's hard to believe that Halloween is just around the corner, coming up next month, and I'll be posting my Halloween build here a month earlier because I have a few things planned on my schedule for October that I thought might interfere with completing a model kit. And the model I'll be working on here in this video is this Planet of the Apes model of Dr. Zaius. I'm going to be entering it into the 2025 Boyd Crompton HobbyLink International Halloween build. This is a great way to remember Boyd. The first one was put on last year, and they're doing it again here at HobbyLink International. And so I thought it'd be fun to build one of these. Now, as you can see, I have two models here, one of Dr. Zaius and one of Cornelius. This Cornelius model I purchased off of eBay, and I'm actually going to be setting this one aside and building it a little bit later. As you know, I completed the $6 Million Man model kit last month. This is the Bionic Bust Out. And by the way, thank you for all the great comments you guys left about that build. I really do appreciate it. But I thought it would be fun to bring 4 kits that are vintage kits. 2 of them are going to be the $6 Million Man, and I've decided on the other 2 to be these Planet of the Apes models. And I was able to get the Fight for Survival kit of the $6 Million Man just recently, so I'll be building that one and the Cornelius model as we get closer to Wonderfest. So this kit of Dr. Zaius now, I actually purchased at a show called Frank & Sons Collectible Show. This takes place up in Orange County about every weekend, and it's essentially a big warehouse that houses all of these vendors that come in to sell collectibles. And here's some video and some pictures of the show. And one booth happened to have vintage model kits, and I found this one stuck in the corner for about $12, so I couldn't pass it up. And so I purchased that 5 years ago. It's been sitting on my shelf ever since. Now, what prompted me to move ahead with this model was the Bionic Bust Out build and how I was able to replace the head from that model kit, because one of the things that bugs me about these models are the head sculpts or the head pieces. And so I decided to go online to see if I could find one of Dr. Zaius, and sure enough I was able to find this one. This is from Rizar Miniatures. Check it out. You can find this on Cults3D.com, and you can see that it's part of a bust, but I was able to separate the headpiece using a program called Mesh Mixer. So I've resized the head and I'm ready to go with building the model kit, but before we get started, let's take a look and see what comes inside the box. Okay, well first we have a sheet of instructions. It's not a very complicated model to put together. We can see that the figure comes in 2 parts here. We have the head and the arms, and then we have the base. Alright, these are the parts to the figure. We have the torso and the legs that come together like this. So we'll have a seam to address along the sides. We have his arms, and the sleeves have this detailing here. So we'll also obviously have a seam to have to address here as well. Here's a look now at the headpiece that I 3D printed and how it compares to the one that is included in the kit. You can see how the sculpt has a better likeness, and I also like how the hair is fuller. Now, as mentioned, I separated the headpiece from the torso of the bust that it's part of. I decided not to do too much with shaping and contouring with mesh mixture. It does give you the ability to do that. I felt I could just do a better job with my sanding tool and being able to eye and estimate that as I need to. So I have a little cleanup and some fine tuning to do before attaching them to the body. And these are now, of course, the pieces to the display base. This is the main part. You can see they have it textured here. And these two pieces now will fit onto the back side, like so. And then we have this piece that's going to go on the front, which I believe is like a lab kit. And these are the two remaining pieces here. Alright, we're ready to get started here with our build. My plan is, of course, to replace the head sculpt, but not do too much more to the kit. I want to kind of leave it as is. I might do some modifications to his suit, but we'll see how that goes as we move along here. The display base, yeah, I was thinking about altering that as well, but I'm going to leave that pretty much as is. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, well, you can see I have the main body and the arms assembled now, and let's just take a look at the arms here real quick. To conceal the seams, I am using Plastic Magic adhesive here, and when the seams are not very prominent, you don't have large gaps, this is a great way to do it. The adhesive just melts the plastic essentially, and after applying it, you can just use your sandpaper to smooth everything out, and it does a really good job with hiding that seam. Now, I want to draw your attention to these markings along the arm here. Here's a picture of the costume that this is supposed to replicate. Now, Zaius has two costumes in the movie. There's one that we see him in most of the film. That's what this is a picture of here. But then if we go back to this one, you can see he's got some sort of field jacket. These are the last scenes in the movie where they are in that cave. And you can see the costume does have these leather pieces along the length of the arm, but there are no markings there. There are markings on the glove, and unfortunately the designer of this model kit decided to extend those markings onto the arms, and that makes the model inaccurate. Now, I thought I might be able to use Apoxie Sculpt to cover this, but I just think that's going to be more trouble than it's worth, so I'm going to leave those as they are. Moving to the main body now. Now, the first thing you do when you assemble the main body is you have to put these two pieces into the shoulders, because these are the pieces that the arms will hook onto. And once you assemble the two halves, there is a seam all along the length of the model that you have to address. Some of them I was able to use the Plastic Magic adhesive, but others, especially along the upper torso, were too wide, so I had to use Apoxie Sculpt for that, which worked well. Now, one other thing to make note of here are the shoulders, and you'll notice they put markings on these shoulders here too, but if you look at the costume, that is not correct. He's got these leather pieces that are on the shoulder there. And that is one thing I am going to try to do with Apoxie Sculpt, since I have to cover this seam anyway. I'm going to try and replicate that look with Apoxie Sculpt. Well, as you can see, I changed my mind about those markings on the arms. They were really bugging me, and I decided to just move forward with sanding them off. And this is just a video of me doing that. I started out with 280 grit sandpaper and moved up to 400. It took a little time, but I think overall it turned out pretty well. So the arms now are glued into position. This model is made so that the arms could be movable, but I did not want that to be the case. So this is the pose I've decided on, and I'm going to give this overnight time to dry so that they'll be secure in place before putting the Apoxie Sculpt that I'll be using to fill in these gaps. So once the shoulder gaps were filled in and dry, I moved on to using the Apoxie Sculpt to create the leather shoulder pieces. The trimmed pieces were placed onto each shoulder, and I used a plastic spatula to scribe in the embossed lines. So after those shoulder pads were cured, I moved on to one more thing, which is to conceal the chest symbols that came molded with the model, since this particular costume did not have any chest symbols whatsoever. So I had the figure all primed and ready for painting. when I decided to go back and look at a few scenes from the end of the movie where this costume is shown, just to be sure I had everything covered. And take a look at this picture. It turns out there is a leather panel on the back side of that jacket that he wears. Now, if you note, the leather panel is tucked under the cloth, and I decided to try to replicate that look by applying masking tape along the center and then putting down the epoxy sculpt along each side. And I lifted the masking tape from the middle, and it gave me that appearance that I was after. So to finish it off, I applied a thin layer of epoxy sculpt along the middle. And this is how it all turned out. Alright, so I believe I am ready now to begin painting. Let's go ahead and get started with that. Well, as for the color, this is what I'm going to be going with. This is now a mixture of these three colors here. We have Canyon Orange from Americana, we have School Bus Yellow from Folk Art, and from Craftsmart, Spanish Tile. And you can see here I'm mixing the colors up. Now, in the past, when using craft paints, I've suggested filtering the paint through a fine mesh filter, which is something that you can still do, obviously. But my friend Joe Hudson, who uses craft paint all the time for painting figures, doesn't do any of that. He thins it with distilled water. Then he takes the thinned down paint and adds it to his airbrush in drops, along with Creatix's paint reducer, using a ratio of 4 to 5 drops of the paint reducer to 2 to 3 drops of paint. And I find this method of mixing does a great job with allowing you to spray on a smooth application and also avoid clogging up your airbrush. Now let's take a look at some video here that I shot earlier this year at the Pop Culture Museum up in Seattle, which had one of the actual costumes worn in the movie. The costume has held up really well. After doing a little research online, I found the color is described as cantaloupe orange, which when you look up a reference for that color, looks a lot more yellow. So I'm instead going to go with what I feel is a good approximation of what I'm seeing here with these reference shots as my base color. And I will darken it up with some brown for the shadows and use a bit more yellow for the highlights. Well, this is how the body turned out, and I ended up modifying the base color. Now, I first started with adding brown to the base color and spraying on the shadows, as you can see here. And this was followed by the application of the base color that I created first, and it turned out a bit too bright, a bit too orangey. So over that, I decided to spray on an additional coat of this, not too heavily, but it's a combination of this Spanish Tile and fawn color. And that subdued the color a bit, and I'm very happy with the way it all turned out here. Now, the leather parts were all painted with Vallejo's red leather mixed with burnt umber, about an 80 to 20 mix, and I made sure to spray on a gloss coat to all of the leather pieces there. So, ready to move on to the head. So, as you can see, I have two painted heads here, and I have actually been debating this whole time about which one to use. The difference being this one here is a little wider than this one. Now, the one that's more narrow is the first head I had printed, and when placing it on the figure, I thought his mane should be a little fuller. So I went to my slicing software to widen out the head and came out with this one. Now, unpainted, it seemed like the one to go with was the wider one. But widening the head also ended up changing the facial features, making the eyes more narrow and separating them apart just a hair. Now, once you painted them, however, you can see that the one on the right better resembles the actor, and certainly that's understandable because this is the way it was designed to begin with. So, I'll be using this one here. Now, the face was painted using a combination of Vallejo's beige red and mahogany brown for the base color. You've seen me use that combo quite a bit now. And more mahogany was added to the mix for the shadows, and of course it was lightened up with pale flesh for the highlights. Now, as for the hair, this is where the sculpt is a little more stylized, just meaning that there's not quite as much fine detail on the hair. So what I thought would be best to do was to accentuate the shadows or the recesses with brown. So I used Monument Hobbies Light Umber for that. And as you can see in this video, I just dried brush the golden brown that they have onto all of the peaks for the highlights. And I really liked how it all turned out. Alright, well, you're not going to see the figure completed here until the final reveal, which is coming up. But first, let's complete the display base. Alright, so here is the display base put together. I've got the side piece glued onto the main part here. And I have to say, this is not the best design base. This particular joint where the two parts come together is pretty weak. I at first covered the seam here with some epoxy sculpt as well as gluing it from the opposite side. And after testing the figure on the display base, it ended up cracking fairly easily. So I had to go back and add more support, this time just using some leftover milliput that I had here. Now it's pretty solid, and I filled in the crack with more epoxy sculpt. So it's pretty solid now, but just bear in mind if you're putting this together, make sure you're adding some extra support there. I also ended up filling these gaps here between the rocks and this squared off piece there. I felt it looked better by filling those in, and I used epoxy sculpt to also cover the seams of the two halves of this piece here. Alright, so here's the completed base, and I think it turned out well. Now I did add in some of my Mod Podge terrain mix, but was careful not to overdo it this time, sticking to just the corners along here, and sparingly applied it to the flat surfaces, and did a little bit more towards the bottom here along the edge. Now I wanted to replicate the color tones of the rocks and terrain of the cave scene, so I chose this fawn color from Americana, mixed in with burnt umber as my base color. Now I did want to apply some washes, and at first I tried this red-brown wash, but that just didn't work so well, so I turned to an umber wash instead. And after that was dried, I added in some highlights along this Romanesque piece that you see here. The other part that comes with the base includes this flat piece here with this cross design. And they suggested painting the cross gray, but I chose to paint the outer edges with a gray-blue, and then I weathered it so that it matched the rest of the base. The other part is this lab book, and I found some decals on a 172, or at least from a 172 equipment model that I had here, just to add in some details there to the page. Otherwise it looked odd, just kind of sitting there blank. Alright, well that does it with the base, and we are ready for the final reveal. This is where now I stop with the original build now, and we're going to move into making a new display base. Let's take a look. Alright, well it's now time to pivot, and what I'm going to do is set aside that display base and create one that's more appropriate for the character wearing this costume here now. And so what I plan to do is to make a new terrain display base that will reflect what was seen in the cave, because again that's the scene I thought this was from. And I want now this diorama to mimic this scene here, where Dr. Zaius is holding that little doll. And what I was able to do was to find an STL file for a doll with a dress. This was found on cults3d.com. And I printed the doll, and I actually sliced off some of this here because I thought that would help with fitting the doll into his hand. And I also separated the head because I wanted the doll's head to kind of droop backward over the top of his hand. So my plan is to paint the doll up, to weather both the dress and the doll's face, and to use epoxy sculpt putty to make the hair more unruly. Okay, so here is the doll now, and you can see the epoxy sculpt was very effective at creating more hair, and also with weathering and aging the dress around here. So this is what I did. I just took epoxy sculpt and my silicone head sculpting tools to carefully make more hair, and then I used it to add more worn elements to her skirt and the outfit that she has. Alright, well here is the completed doll, and I think it turned out well. The epoxy sculpt was really a big help with creating all that extra hair, and also to make the dress look worn and ragged. So I just used some drab colors, some drab greens and browns for the dress, and of course various flesh tones for the face and the arms. And I've attached it now permanently to his hand using 2-part epoxy putty. Well, let me get you caught up with how things are coming along with the display base. The idea here is to replicate the look of the dig site we see in the scene I'm trying to depict. Let's go ahead and take a look at the screenshot now. As with many archaeological dig sites, there are various levels to them. And note how there's not a straight edge as you go from one level to the next, but instead you see mounds of dirt and larger rocks. And that is what I tried to do here. This was done first by gluing 2 pieces of foamular, and I had used my hot wire cutter to carve out the edge to give a slightly irregular contour. Next, this was filled in with air dry clay to create those mounds of dirt, and in addition, I used the clay to make a bunch of rocks. Now, this was all then covered by my Mod Podge mix, and again, this is made up of Mod Podge, the base color paint, along with some T50 terrain mix from Woodland Scenics, and I think it's a great way to recreate a grainy, dirt-covered texture for display bases just like this. So what I plan to do is to add in these bones and animal skull, and again, this was inspired by what I see in the screenshot. Let's take another look. You can see that there is an animal head skull sitting there, and these STL files were found on Thingiverse. It's a dog skull along with a couple of bones from a deer skeleton. Alright, well here is the completed display base. I'm very pleased with how it all turned out. You can see I have the plastic strips of styrene glued onto the side. The bones have been placed onto the terrain there. Here's some video of me embedding that skull into the foamular. After gluing the skull in place, I ended up just using some air dry clay to fill it all in. I textured it and used a Mod Podge mix as with everything else and applied the stains. So for the stain, I ended up using the same brown umber wash as I did before, and yeah, I think it all turned out pretty well. Now I did add an extra hole for each boot because I glued on an extra support for the figure. Just as with the $6 Million Man, I want to be able to take this apart and put it back together again to make it easy to transport. Alright, well I am finally ready to show you the completed project, and that's coming up in the final reveal in just a second. Alright guys, well here is the completed modified Dr. Zaius, along with a brand new display base that ties in much better with the revised figure. The kit itself is from Aurora, which was a re-release of the original 8R model first put out in the 1970s. The figure is about 1/12 in scale, as he stands a little over 6 inches in height. Let's go and take a look at the build. So as mentioned in the intro, I originally thought the suit on this figure was inaccurate, so I started off by making some changes to bring it closer to what we saw in the very first film. That meant removing the molded details on the arms and chest, then adding shoulder pads and a strip down the back to represent the leather elements from the movie costume. The result is a fairly close match to the screen-used outfit. For painting, I used mixes of craft colors to replicate the subdued oranges of the original wardrobe. Now, the one modification I intended to make from the very beginning was to replace the headpiece with a sculpt I had found on cults3d.com. The head was part of a bust, but I was able to separate it and size it accordingly. And I think you'll agree this looks much better than the one included in the kit and has a decent likeness to the actor. So let's take a look at what the figure looked like standing on the original display base that was included. And as you look here towards the bottom, there are these pieces that I was originally confused about because I didn't recall seeing anything like them anywhere in the first movie. I see now, however, that they very much resemble the props seen in Beneath the Planet of the Apes, representing the missile controls along with the book and symbols that were in front of the nuclear weapon. Well, now that I have modified the figure, this base no longer suits it, so I decided to create a totally new display that would. Now, as mentioned in the intro, I thought this was supposed to depict the scene at the archaeological site that was shown towards the movie's end. In keeping with that idea, I went back to some of the scenes of the film for inspiration. So note that, as is typical with archaeological sites, you see various layers with mounds of dirt piled up around the edges as you go from one level to the next. And along with that are some scattered artifacts and bones. So, as with many of my model displays these days, I chose to use foamular as a material of choice and was able to recreate the look of the transition from one level to the other by carving the foamular and using air dry clay. I was able to locate STL files for a dog skull and some miscellaneous bones on Thingiverse and place them into the lower layer. Now, all along I had been using and showing you these pictures of Dr. Zaius holding a human baby doll, and I felt that this would be a great additional detail to include to tie all this together. Not surprisingly, I was able to find an STL of a doll in a dress, which was then printed to the appropriate size. I used apoxie sculpt to add more hair and to help with weathering and aging of the dress. Creating the new display wasn't difficult, and I think it all turned out looking pretty convincing. So initially, I intended to just build the Aurora kit with the only modification being the headpiece, but ended up with a completely modified model instead. I am actually holding on to the base that came with the kit, as I might be able to get a hold of another Dr. Zaius figure. In the meantime, I'm happy with the unique piece that I ended up with. Well, that is going to be a wrap for this project, and I hope you enjoyed following along and that you excuse me for making that huge error at the very beginning. it didn't even dawn on me that this model might be related to any other movie other than the original Planet of the Apes. But in the end, I guess it served as a good example of how you can modify a figure and in turn modify and make a custom display base for that figure. So hopefully you got something out of that. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me here on my channel. Now, no doubt one burning question in your mind is, where did he get that costume? So let me take a minute to tell you about it. So I got the mask from a company called 8mania.com. You can still find them online. And they're a group of guys who are huge Planet of the Apes fans. I think they are makeup artists, as I understand it, who work in the film industry. And they not only sell these beautiful masks that resemble the characters, but they also sell the full-on prosthetics. So if you want to go all out and apply that, it no doubt takes some time and some skill to do that. They have that available as well. Now, the rest of the costume was designed by a good friend of mine who is a seamstress, and she did all the work with putting everything together. And this was something I designed for Halloween back in 2017, and it's really one of my favorite costumes that I have on hand. And just a reminder now, the build is going to be submitted to the 2025 Boyd Crompton Halloween group build, and you'll be able to see all the models that were submitted to this group build on Halloween night, as Kenny Conklin will do a live stream showing off all of the builds. All right, guys, well, that's going to do it for now, and I want to wish you all the best and have a safe and happy Halloween. Take care, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.